On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the sun rose over the Philippine Islands with the same calm light that marked most days in the Pacific. The air was warm, the sky clear, and the American airfields scattered across Luzon were just starting to move through their normal routines. Pilots were waking up, ground crews were checking equipment, and the distant coastline shone quietly under the early light. Most of them did not know that only hours earlier, Pearl Harbor had been attacked. The news had not reached every base yet, and the real scale of what had happened was still unclear. It was a moment suspended between peace and war, where daily habits continued even as danger rushed closer. Among the young airmen stationed there was Lieutenant Kenneth Marler Taylor, a 26-year-old fighter pilot trained on the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. Taylor had joined the military only a few years earlier, coming from a small town in Oklahoma. He had a calm nature, a steady way of speaking, and a straightforward personality that made him well-liked among other pilots. He was skilled, disciplined, and focused, but he was still early in his military career. Nothing in his training had prepared him for what was about to unfold. Taylor was resting in his quarters that morning, still tired from an alert mission that had stretched late into the night. Fighter units in the Philippines had been on edge for days, expecting tension but not open combat. The world had felt unsettled, but no one imagined a full-scale assault arriving so suddenly. As Taylor prepared to leave the barracks for routine duty, he heard a distant rumble. At first, it sounded like thunder rolling over the ocean, but the sky was completely clear. When he stepped outside to check, he noticed movement far above the horizon, dark specks flying in tight formation. The shapes grew larger, their engines louder and sharper. Within seconds, it became clear that these were not American planes. Japanese aircraft were approaching in a large, disciplined group, flying in the classic V formations the pilots had studied during training. Taylor's instincts sharpened immediately. The sound of the engines became a roar as the first wave descended, and without warning, explosions erupted across the airfield. Bombs fell in rapid bursts. The ground shook under the shock waves. Planes parked wingtip to wingtip were engulfed in flames. Smoke rose in thick columns as ground crews ran for cover. Taylor did not hesitate. He sprinted toward the flight line, even as more explosions hit nearby. There was almost no time to think about procedure or orders. Survival depended on action, and Taylor knew that if no one got airborne quickly, the entire squadron would be destroyed on the ground. Most of the planes around him were being hit before pilots could even climb in, but there were two P-40 Warhawks positioned at the far edge of the field that had not yet been damaged. One of them was his. Fuel tanks were not full, ammunition loads were incomplete. The aircraft had been partially serviced after the long night, but standing still meant certain defeat. Taylor climbed into the cockpit, strapped in fast, and signaled the nearby crewmen to pull away the wheel chocks. The engines of the P-40 Warhawk roared to life, shaking with the power that had made the aircraft famous for its durability and speed in a dive. As the ground crew cleared the way, Taylor pushed the throttle forward and raced along the runway. Bombs continued to fall, and fragments of debris scattered across the pavement. The heat of burning fuel washed over the cockpit as he accelerated. For a moment, the ground rose unevenly under the blasts, and it felt like the aircraft might not lift off. But then the P-40 lifted off, climbing sharply into the sky, leaving the burning airfield behind. What Taylor saw once he gained altitude was overwhelming. Japanese planes filled the air, bombers in formation, dive bombers peeling downward, and fighters circling the edges of the attack pattern. The sky had become a moving battlefield. Taylor was completely alone among them. He climbed higher, hoping to find an opening above the formation. When he reached a safe altitude, he banked sharply and dove toward the nearest group of attackers. He fired in short, controlled bursts. Tracer rounds cut across the sky, and within seconds, he saw one bomber pull away, trailing smoke. Another fighter broke formation to avoid his attack. The sudden resistance from a lone American pilot seemed to catch the attackers off guard.
Taylor pulled out of the dive and climbed again, looking for the next opening. He knew the Japanese formation was too large to challenge head-on for long, but he also understood a key advantage: constant movement. By attacking from different angles and not staying in one place long, he could survive longer than expected. Each climb took precious fuel, and each dive burned through ammunition quickly, but for the moment there was no other option. Minutes later, a second wave of enemy aircraft approached from the north, much larger than the first. Their formation stretched far across the sky, almost like a moving wall. Taylor realized he now faced not just dozens, but more than 60 enemy aircraft moving in layers above and around him. Their formation was so large that it cast moving shadows on the smoke rising from the ground. He turned directly into them. The air around him became a blur of motion, planes crossing from every direction, engines roaring so loudly the sound vibrated through the cockpit. Taylor squeezed the trigger again, and the P-40 vibrated as the guns fired. One fighter peeled away damaged, another pulled sharply upward to avoid collision. Taylor was flying at the edge of the plane's limits, pushing it through tight climbs and dives. Every second demanded focus. But ammunition soon ran low. Taylor returned to a secondary airfield, landing quickly amid the chaos. Ground crews rushed to him, shocked that he had not only survived, but had engaged so many enemy aircraft alone. They reloaded his guns as fast as possible, fueled the P-40, and sent him back up again. Taylor climbed once more into a sky that was still filled with enemy aircraft. Hours had passed since the first explosion, but the waves continued. He re-entered the fight and used the same pattern: rise fast, strike quickly, then break away before being surrounded. The P-40 was rugged, capable of taking damage and still flying, and Taylor trusted its strength as he weaved through enemy fire. During one attack run, a burst from an enemy fighter ripped across the P-40, striking near the cockpit and injuring Taylor in his left hand and arm. The pain was sharp, but he continued flying, pulling away from the attackers and gaining altitude again. He knew he could not stay airborne forever, yet he refused to land while enemy planes still threatened the field. By the time fuel once again dropped to critical levels, Taylor dove toward the nearest landing strip. The airfield was damaged, smoke rising from shattered buildings and burning fuel tanks, but parts of the runway were still usable. He landed the P-40 and taxied toward a cluster of surviving hangars. Ground crews rushed out to help him, noticing blood on his gear and the damage on the fuselage. Taylor stepped out slowly, exhausted but steady. The attack on the Philippines continued throughout the day, leaving heavy destruction behind. Many American aircraft had been lost on the ground, and the strategic blow was severe. But among the stories that emerged afterward, Taylor's stand became one of the earliest accounts of a single pilot challenging an overwhelming force in the opening hours of the Pacific War. His efforts did not stop the attack. They did not change the outcome of that day, but they proved something else. Readiness, instinct, and courage can exist even in the first moments of surprise. Taylor's actions forced enemy fighters to break formation, disrupted bombing patterns, and protected sections of the airfield from even heavier damage. His unexpected resistance became a symbol of the intense and chaotic way the war began for many American pilots across the Pacific. After landing, Taylor did not speak much about what happened. He received medical attention, made a brief report, and prepared himself mentally for the next mission. For him, it was not a moment of glory, but a response to what the situation demanded. Years later, military historians would look back at that day and describe how one pilot had taken to the air against staggering odds, acting not out of heroism, but out of duty. And in the documentary record of World War II, the story of that December morning remains a clear example of how history can turn suddenly, how one decision can matter, and how, even against overwhelming numbers, a single pilot in a single aircraft can shape the first moments of a battle.